again. Our next panel discussion will be moderated by Benny Starr, the Alliance's Artist in Residence. Through his residency, Benny is working with our staff and the entire Alliance network to infuse arts and cultural strategies into our thinking, problem solving, and programming. Benny is joined today by the winners of the Outstanding Artist Award. Tis Peterman, representing the Salmon Speakers team, is Special Projects Consultant with the Southeast Alaska Indigenous Transboundary Commission. The commission represents 15 of the 19 federally recognized tribes in Southeast Alaska. Mary Coaster, Director of Project DRAW for Science and Kids Teaching Flood Resilience at the University of South Carolina Center for Science Education, will be representing Friends of Gadsden Creek, alongside Tamika Gadsden, a Charleston, South Carolina-based activist, podcast host, and Twitch streamer.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to speak with you all today. Your work is inspirational, and I'm looking forward to talking more with you about your artistic processes. Both Salmon Speakers and Friends of Gadsden Creek are being recognized today for their creativity in driving a more equitable water future. Through different mediums, these artists are building greater awareness and are also creating new solutions to deeply rooted issues. I have a few questions for you all so our audience can get to know your work a little better. If you all don't mind, we'll have you take turns in responding to these questions. The first question that I have is for Tis. What water challenges does your work seek to address?
Right now, we're seeking to address the transboundary mining threats from BC into Southeast Alaska. The headwaters of three major rivers are being threatened by mining resource extraction in BC.
Thank you for that answer, Tis. And this next question is for Mary. What water challenges does your work seek to address?
Thank you for the opportunity, Benny, to talk about that. I think the only way I can answer that question is as the teacher activist who seeks to make education matter in ways that aren't just about my students getting the right answer on a standardized test, but instead to sort of afford them opportunities to see what's happening in plain sight and why it matters to develop a deep relationship with the water. I'll give you an example. Not one single student with whom I worked in the 4 K-12 schools in the Gadsden Creek watershed even knew that this critical wetland was right across the street from their home and their schools, much less that it had been the center of the culture, commerce, and recreation of the largest African American community on the peninsula of Charleston. And then to have it all taken away from the city, covered with trash and reclaimed for commercial use for massive corporate gain. To a person they asked, why didn't we know any of this stuff before? And so for today, I put together a synthesis of the discussions with the 13-year-olds who heard the story for the first time. And here's what they said. Whoa, what you mean? This whole area used to belong to us? Our families owned homes right on a huge salt marsh like rich people? We had riverfront property and businesses here. Our families were baptized in this creek and it was beautiful. And we were allowed to swim in it and fish and shrimp there too. You're saying they took all that from us? And all the flooding we're having now is the creek's fault? And now it has to die? Enough already. So as you saw in the art they produced, these students were releasing their natural affinity for questioning as scientists and as artists. And then they went on a quest to find evidence to support the claim that not only did the creek matter, but they did too.
Thank you so much for that, Mary. Thank you for sharing those words from your students as well. Mika, the same question for you. What water challenges does your work seek to address?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I feel honored to be here on this call to share more about the work that the Friends of Gadsden Creek Collective is leading in Charleston, South Carolina. I think most succinctly, Benny, to answer the question, we're confronting environmental racism, historic environmental racism that has been visited upon a community of Black and Gullah Geechee descendants for generations. That's the most succinct answer. What I'm also hoping to do, as a compliment to the other contributors from the collective, like Mary, who apply a very important scientific lens to the work. I'm very excited and enthusiastic about making sure that the work that we lead has the critical race analysis that's often missing in philanthropy and also in a lot of advocacy groups that focus on conservation or environmental issues, especially in the low country of South Carolina. African Americans, Black and brown people, BIPOC people in general, disabled people, poor people, often are left out of the conversation. And so I hope that the work that we lead at Friends of Gadsden Creek serves as a model for other communities on how to combat environmental racism and do it in a way that centers those most affected by the injustice.
I couldn't agree more, Mika. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing that with us today. And I want to stay with that because we're talking about community. We're talking about specific people and centering people in so much of this work. And I want to ask this question to Tis. Can you tell us about how you engage community members in your artistic process?
Well, this is such a big issue with transboundary mining because it affects both the First Nations in BC and the tribes in the U.S. side. So rather than pile on yet another heavy issue, and we weren't getting that big of a reaction from a lot of people that we wanted to, we started reaching out to put a face on this river by interviewing Coltan people, which is north on the BC side, and Tlingit people and Haida people on the U.S. side of the border. And in that whole process, we discovered not only family members that we've been displaced by that border, but we heard stories that we had more in common than we had thought, as well as telling this history of the river that hasn't been told in such an artistic way in the middle of a pandemic. And in that first debut of our production, we reached out and had over 1,000 listeners, the first debut in May of 2020. And it was done during the pandemic. It was supposed to be a live show and people telling their stories that connected both sides of the border of Indigenous people. And it wasn't the direction we were going, but it widened our audience so much better than we had even hoped.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Storytelling is such a powerful tool. It resonates with me a lot. And I love the fact how you touched on it wasn't supposed to be what it was, but you all allowed it to become what it was, and it was still so impactful. Same question I'm going to then ask to you, Mary. Can you tell us about how you engage community members in your artistic process?
Yeah, that was such a powerful testimony of Tiss's, is how they acting as artists, they were let themselves be surprised by what could happen. Likewise, in my own classes, I teach that art can become a way of becoming actually who you are, while at the same time inviting you to lean into other perspectives. In my classes, we also acknowledge that just the act of making art is to make yourself vulnerable. It can be kind of scary. It can blow up in your face, right? But in the process, you can bring your minds and your bodies and your spirit to the work, and you feel what Tiss has said, this kind of bridging and connection that wouldn't have been there if you hadn't made this sort of messy thing together, right? So our art in Gadsden Creek is specifically directed to how we might use our art, whatever it may take, to speak truth to power. I asked 3 questions of my students, whether they're science students or art students. What have you noticed? Do we go out in the field, into the place, into the contested space? What do you now know? And here's the biggie. What will you do? In other words, what art will you make that shows how you feel about what you know. And then once I make those invitations, I just stand back and bear witness to the powerful, artful makings. To be more specific, say at the College of Charleston in my class at the Sustainability Literacy Institute, I made a very specific assignment. Here it goes. As you consider why flooding situations are often so much worse in low-income communities like Gadsden Green, show through your art that you have employed systems thinking. In other words, ask the following. What's connected to what in the Gadsden Green situation? And what patterns change over time as well in cause and effect relationships are there? So that's your rubric to assess yourself. Now for my second graders working at Mitchell Elementary, we made, again, in a pandemic, because I wasn't able to go into the classroom myself, I have a heart condition. So in a pandemic, this would have never happened, just like Tis said, we made this book together called Us in the Creek. And it was all about celebrating our relationship with these students who live in Gadsden Green about why this creek matters. And I want to show you how inspiring their art was. So to accompany the text, we know why you matter and why our community matters too. Look what they drew. Can you see it? A really strong, powerful, muscled arm next to a beautiful creek with a shrimp. Out of the mouth of babes. You know, our children have our clearest vision, and I believe are our planet's most authentic artists.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Mary. Mika, I want to ask you the same question. Can you tell us about how you engage community members in your artistic process?
Sure. One thing that I'm extraordinarily excited about and sharing with this audience is that recently the Friends of Gadsden Creek Collective partnered with a local art gallery, the Redux Contemporary Art Gallery in Charleston. And we currently have on display, on exhibition, Title Futures. So for me, not only does this combine art with an activist message, it required engagement, it required outreach, building community, building relationship with actual residents of the Gadsden Green Project. This is the area that we're working to protect. And so it was vitally important to the success of the exhibition, which is still on until September 11th. It's vitally important to include their contributions because what we want to do is want to make sure that our work is not paternalistic. We want to make sure that they actually are given a platform or extended a platform to where they can outline and articulate the grievances that they've had to navigate. And so it's really important to make sure they're part of the process. So whenever we do mutual aid, Benny, whenever we do things like this art exhibition, we have to have the community involved hands-on. And we also have to create bridges. So that means that perhaps we provide stipends, perhaps we ask them what they need, what needs they need that need to be met to make them more able to show up in the spaces that we're trying to bring them into.
Right. And I think that's incredibly important. I want to stay on that. I want to stay on that with you. I want to ask you from your perspective, with the way you see everything, and especially touching on the fact of not wanting the work to be paternalistic. How do you use that work? How do you use your work to disrupt and challenge existing inequities?
Yeah.
You could elaborate on it.
How do I use my work to disrupt? Well, honestly, the mere existence of being a Black body in Charleston with this last name Gadsden is completely coincidental, but not coincidental if you understand Charleston's role in the transatlantic slave trade. I think the mere presence of someone like me in this body, a Gullah Geechee descendant, defying oppressive forces, refusing to shrink, refusing to be silenced by environmental racism. I think that in itself is a disruption. I think also creating platforms or finding spaces like a Redux to where we can put the Black experience, we can position it, we can display it, we can talk about it, we can storytell about it. Putting it in a redux to me is extraordinarily disruptive in a city that's hell bent on maintaining this patina of politeness, as I phrase it. We like to pierce that bubble that people like to put themselves in through tourism and let them know, no, there's an alternate reality, or rather there's an actual or more honest reality that you need to make contact with. And I think that our work, my work separately, and our work as a collective of Friends of Gadsden Creek does that.
Wow. And certain things I heard you say, your experience and just your presence and the storytelling, the way that you choose to tell that story, the honesty in it. I want to direct that same question to Tis. How do you use your work to disrupt and challenge existing inequities?
I love her words, alternate reality, something we've all grown up with. And what we have been doing in our work, which includes When the Salmon Spoke, is shining a light on the disparities that Indigenous people feel on both sides of the border. And more so, that is happening today than ever before. But what we're also trying to do is tell stories, and what's happening now as a result of our work is that we just met the other day with Indigenous leaders from BC, and Indigenous leaders from Alaska, Washington, Montana, and Idaho. And we'll have our third summit at the right after Thanksgiving. So we're going to dive in. It seems like on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, that's out there in BC. It's coming to the U.S., but it seems like there's no platform for what it means to Indigenous people. So what we're going to do is create that table for Indigenous people to actually tell the governments exactly what that means to us and how we can protect the lands around us.
I love that so much. I love what you said about creating that table and even expanding the value of artists and the creations that artists put forward, creating that table to tell them what is needed. I love that so much. And the final question I'm going to direct to Mary. You've used the term staying with the trouble in your descriptions of what Friends of Gadsden Creek is doing. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, kind of like what Tis said, building the table, right? The phrase staying with the trouble certainly did not originate with me. More than one activist has used a similar call to action. I lift up, civil rights leader John Lewis, who called on young people, right, to get in good trouble. That is to find a way to get in the way, to push for transformation and to agitate for reform. And I have to say, I'm probably one of the older members of Friends of Gadsden Creek. It is the energy of our young people, like Mika. It's just phenomenal. And then, feminist Donna Haraway uses the term staying with the trouble. And when she uses that term, she's talking about the development of a kinship with the more than human world. And this is surely what the Salmon speakers have achieved with their magnificent work to preserve and protect their brethren, the salmon. Ever since the permit to destroy Gadsden Creek was submitted by the developer, the members of the Friends of Gadsden Creek have made good trouble, stayed with the trouble, lifting up the Press Creek and the African American community's inherent resilience. It is not okay to call this community a victim. They have a profound inherent resilience. And when people find out about the history of the takings from this African American community and a critical wetland named Gadsden Creek, which long sustained them, their first reaction very often is, oh my gosh, they're shocked. But then, as Mika will say, and I will say, and all of us will say, having empathy for a situation is simply not enough.
Right.
It is through our art that we and the Salmon speakers, and I wrote this down so I didn't mess it up, We have sought to translate information and empathy into action to restore, protect, celebrate, and above all, resist. It is through our art that we trouble, as in to trouble, as in a verb, as in an action verb, that we seek to tap in to the resilience of a salt marsh that can grow up straight through the asphalt and a fish that always knows the way home. We are all teachers and all learners. And I want to share with you one of the most powerful messages that I have ever seen as a teacher. And I came across it from the work of scholar and urban educator Christopher Emdin. And he cites Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes in his song, Wake Up, Everybody. Wake up, everybody. Time to teach in a new way. Maybe then they'll listen to what you have to say. Wake up, everybody. No more sleeping in bed. No more backward thinking. Time for thinking ahead. The world won't get no better if we just let it be. The world won't get no better. We got to change it, yeah. Just you and me. It's hard to say it any better than that.
I agree. That's one of my favorite songs. And one of the things.
Isn't it amazing?
It's amazing. It's amazing record. Teddy Pendergrass on lead. The thing that you said that's going to stick with me is empathy into action. Being empathetic is good, but it is not enough. Empathy into action. Mika, Tiz, Mary, I had such a really good time talking to you all today. I look forward to seeing what's next for your teams. Your collaborative and thoughtful work is incredibly valued, not only to the communities that you serve, but also to the sector, and it's much needed. And beyond that, I'm happy to congratulate you all once again on your well-deserved award for Outstanding Artist. Thank you all for pushing the boundaries of what is possible and for continually fighting for equity. Your work is incredibly necessary, and it brings me great happiness as a Black man to celebrate your teams as the first ever Outstanding Artist Water Prize winners. So I want to thank you all for lending us your time today, and thank you for the work that you all continue to do. I look forward to seeing you all stay with the trouble.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Benny.
Thank you, Benny, Tis, Mary, and Tamika. It's so exciting to award 2 winners for the Outstanding Artist Award this year. We are deeply inspired by the